out of this? That John the Baptist was critical of that marriage, and Aretas was also unhappy with that marriage. And so it makes a lot more sense for people to look at what Herod did to John the Baptist and say, aha, that's why Herod lost his army. But I only get that by putting the two things together. It's a subtle agreement. And the agreement is so subtle that you can't say one person has read the other story and written in details in order to, make it fit. Because, in fact, they only each say half of the story. I want to look at some more examples of the reliability of the New Testament. This time, how the New Testament fits the time and space it's talking about. We can look at all sorts of examples, and I'll be looking at some of these on Sunday night, of how when we do tests for reliability, we find that the New Testament knows these sorts of things correctly. Now, I find when I go to a new place, I don't know very much about it. I didn't know, not having been to Darmstadt this time of year before, what the temperature would be like. I suppose nowadays I can look that sort of thing up on the internet, but even then, until you've been there and felt it, you don't quite know. At least that's the way I feel it. And then there are things about culture which you don't know. So the New Testament has all sorts of details about this in the Gospels. And we can ask, do they get the names of the plants right? Do they get the names, the way the society is stratified right? Do they get the right sort of jobs for people to be doing in the right sort of proportion? And so on. Just one of the tests I want to look at is the test of language, and we'll apply it to Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel has in it, although it's written in Greek, a number of times when it mentions Aramaic words or occasionally Hebrew words. I want to ask the question, how would anyone writing a Gospel know those words? Well, the easiest way to know those words is simply to have been there or to have spoken to someone who's been there. Because it's not as if I could go into a bookshop in Rome and buy a book that would describe to me the low and unimportant language that people spoke in Israel. Because, Romans weren't interested in those sort of minority things. You know what? There are certain cultures where you have minority languages and everyone looks down on them. No one writes books on how to speak in Alabama dialect, do they? It's just, you can go there and you can look, but who cares? Who wants to do that? So how does someone get that sort of detail? And yet at the same time, in Mark's Gospel, we have Latin words. So the word for John the Baptist's executor is just a Latin word, speculator, put in Greek letters. There are two ways of doing the name centurion, someone who's in charge of 100. You could use the Greek word for centurion, or you can just take the Latin word and stick it into Greek. That's what Mark's Gospel does. It's got coins, which are Roman coins and so. And it also, interestingly enough, when it talks about Jesus being crucified and says, Simon of Cyrene carried his cross, he says, by the way, that's the father of Alexander and Rufus. And you think, who? I've not heard of Alexander and Rufus, and you haven't. We don't know who they are. But Mark, as he's writing through in chapter 15, verse 21, says, the father of Alexander and Rufus, presupposing that at least the very first readers would have known who he was talking about. And those are nice, particularly Rufus, a nice Latin name. We can look at some internal criteria for the reliability of the Gospels. I just give you one. When we look at the four Gospels, they all mention Galilee more than Judea. Galilee's the bit in the north, and Judea's the bit in the south where Jerusalem was. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but brought up in Nazareth in the north in Galilee, and that's where he did most of his ministry. And of course, that's a very good reason to mention Galilee most of the time. Okay? Galilee is mentioned more. But that's the noun. What about the adjectives? Galilean and Judean. Now, I've added two more columns and I'm afraid this one on the right is rather big, that light green one, which is Judean, or as it comes out in some translations, Jew. But what we see is whereas Galilee always outnumbers Judea, when we get the adjectives, apart from in Luke when they're about 50-50, Galilean is always less than Judean. You see, it's the opposite way round. Why is that? Because you don't go into, you don't go up downtown, to downtown Dallas and said, I went to downtown Dallas and I met a Texan. You don't, because there are lots of Texans around the place. I don't walk around Cambridge and say, come back and talk to my wife and say, I met an Englishman. You just don't, because there are plenty. So actually, you often talk about the area you are in, but you less often talk about that as sort of distinctive of people, because that's the way most people are. That subtle agreement, the subtle pattern, shows that the Gospels are basically written from a Galilean perspective. You see, they're about Galilee, but also from a Galilean perspective. That fits with the traditional claims about who wrote the things. You see. Let's look at another argument. We can look at the manuscript evidence. People often say, how can I trust the New Testament? We're going to wrap up quite quickly. I'm going to whiz through this. Can I trust that it's really been handed down accurately? Well, of course, there's more manuscript evidence for the New Testament than there is for other ancient works from the time. One person put a very good argument for this, and I can't better it, and it goes like this. Classical scholars accept the authenticity of all sorts of classical works, whether it's Plato, whether it's Suetonius, whether it's Livy. They accept them often with very few manuscripts, and often quite late manuscripts. Well, with the New Testament we have earlier manuscripts and more manuscripts. You can get more details if you like. So out of consistency, if we accept one, we should accept the other. Sometimes this argument gets put in a less correct form. And the form of the argument goes like this. The New Testament has more manuscripts than any other work, therefore it should be accepted as authentic. The problem with that argument is there are more copies of yesterday's USA Today. Does that mean everything it says is right? Well, no. I'm not saying that because there are lots of copies, it's necessarily correct. I'm saying there's an argument to be consistent. If you're going to accept classical works, and presumably the classical scholars who accept the classical works have done lots of investigation to see if there are good grounds for it, if you're going to accept that, then to be consistent you should also accept the New Testament. That's slightly different. It says you already accept this, now accept that. By the way, that's also how I would argue that people should trust in Jesus. Let me explain. I don't argue that I can prove Jesus to people, in the sense of a scientific or mathematical proof. My argument is this. Jesus is a person. You trust persons. You trust people under certain circumstances. We all do it. I'm asking you to do the same to Jesus as you do to those other people. Some people commit themselves in a serious relationship with people based on a pretty small amount of evidence. Pretty small amount of evidence that that person is not going to hurt them. Or that something's going to happen to that person that's going to hurt them and pain them. This is what we do in life. I mean, how much evidence did I seek that my heart would not be really hurt before I sought to become a father? Not much. I mean, you can't take out that sort of evidence. We make commitments on a personal level all the time without asking for absolute knockdown proof, and yet somehow when it comes to the person of Jesus, people want to move the goalposts, and ask for a completely different type of evidence that they never asked for anything else in the whole of life. And I want to say that's inconsistent, you see? So I want to say there is plenty of evidence for Jesus, but let's be reasonable. And remember that we're dealing with evidence about persons. One more thing about this. People often ask for proof when none of the most important things in life can be proven in that way. Let's think of a simple one. Can you prove that your mother loves you or loved you? Can you prove it? Can you prove that anyone loves you? Does it matter that someone loves you? Yes. But at the end of the day, when someone says, I've got some proof that someone loves you, you can always say that's not real proof. They could be doing that good action to me out of self-interest, or to make themselves feel better. You can read that cynically. You can do it all the time. So some of the most fundamental things in life we can't have that sort of proof for. Do you see? And it's the same with Jesus. Yes, there is all sorts of historical evidence for Jesus, but I also want to say that his love is something that you can accept just as you accept the love of your father or your mother without questioning. Anyway, that's a little excursus. Coming on to manuscripts. There are some very early manuscripts. This one from Manchester comes from the 2nd century, and it's a bit of John. Now we know that John was written in Ephesus. We saw that earlier, which is in Turkey. And yet within 50 years of having been written, here we have a manuscript, a part of John chapter 18, from southern Egypt. So these things spread, and of course, just as Christianity spread, the farther and faster Christian copies spread, the harder it is to think that anyone could ever conspire to change them all. Because they'd have to be very, very, very busy, and they'd have to have a very large budget. So I want to argue, and I can just go through this, and we can impose on it a modern English translation. It really fits exactly with what you have. And we've got one of our videos on our website, which is about this fragment. We can know quite a bit about it comes from a book, has a nice top margin and so on. I could go then a little bit later than this, and I could find the opening of John's Gospel. This is from around the year 200, and I can read this. I can read these letters, and I can also teach you how to read them. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. So if you want to find a word in the first 14 or so verses of John, or I don't know, maybe 10 verses of John. I don't know, how far does it go? It takes a bit of time sometimes to get your eyes adjusted to that. But the point is, I can find the word for you. You find your English Bible, I'll find the word for you. It really is all there. We can also say the number of manuscripts is really incredible, better than classical works. And yet we're not dependent on any single one of those. We could throw away our best manuscript and still know what the text says. In fact, we could throw away our earliest 5,000 manuscripts if we liked and still know what the text said, which is quite a nice thing to be able to do. Not that we should do that. Then there's the question of when could anyone have changed the New Testament? Well, some people say, couldn't some emperor like Constantine have changed the New Testament? No. Quite simply, why not? Well, before his time, churches are divided. That means if you change one lot's Bible, what about the other ones? There are poor communications. Christianity has got outside the Roman Empire, and people have begun translating the New Testament into lots of different languages as well, like Coptic and Latin and Syriac. But after Constantine, Christianity has spread even further. The Bible's been translated into even more languages. It's even harder. It's got even further outside the Roman Empire. That means there's never been in history a Roman emperor or a pope or any important person who's ever been in a position to change everyone's Bibles. Finally, could it all have been made up? Well, reasons why I don't think Christianity couldn't have been made up is that Christians suffer too much, they're too disorganised, too divided, and also too truthful. We know sometimes people can emphasise truthfulness and actually be lying, But within an organisation, an emphasis on truthfulness holds back lies systemically. We can also say that the message at the centre of Christianity is fundamentally too foolish. Two things at the centre of Christianity which are too foolish. One is the belief in the resurrection, which for people back then was simply a disgusting thought. For most Romans, they aspired to going to some place without their bodies after they died, to a realm of thought or of spirit or of mind. Coming back physically was disgusting, and that's often an objection to Christianity that was raised. So who would make that up? It's too foolish a message. But the second really foolish part of the message is this, that the person you should worship was God crucified for your sins. Because if you think about what crucifixion was the way that the Romans maintained their rule of terror. It was the way that they showed to any rebel slaves or anyone else like that they were in charge. That's why you didn't want to go against the Roman authority. And so anyone who's been crucified has been demonstrated to be a loser. So how would someone who's been shown to be a loser become worshipped like that? This is how someone did a bit of graffiti on a wall in the 2nd century. This actually comes from Rome. What we have here is a cross with a donkey shown backwards, so the buttocks make it more embarrassing. And then we have next to him someone with a raised hand. I'll just give you another view of this to make it slightly easier. And underneath it says, in very scrawled and badly spelt Greek, it says, Alexamenos worships God. A donkey on a cross, right? Now we know that donkeys are renowned in Proverbs for their stupidity. Ridiculousness, in fact. So to worship someone on a cross was viewed as equivalent to worshipping a donkey. It's as ridiculous as you can get. So how on earth did something with that stupid a message, if I can put it that way, foolish a message, get started? I think the resurrection, the reality of Jesus coming back from the dead to say, yes, he really had paid for the punishment of all the sins that we deserve, that is what makes sense of how Christianity began. Other things don't make any sense to me. And so I'd say it's not just like that in history, it's also like that in life. What makes most sense of everything in life is the person of Jesus, that he is God's communication to us, that he is God himself, and that he is also the way to God, that he has taken away our sins. If we put our trust in him, that what he did on the cross was sufficient to pay the punishment for everything we've ever done wrong, and that we, through him, can be friends with the God who made us. That, I think, makes the best sense of everything. Thanks very much for listening. Are there any questions?
I have one.
Yeah, we'll have this gentleman on my right and then one on my left, or if that's right, sir. Yes.
Mine deal with methods of death during the time of Christ. I saw on the slide that where you said it was through stoning.
Oh, that was with James that he was stoned. Yes.
Okay, so was crucifixion happening at that time?
Yes, absolutely. So what happened is that the Jews would stone people. So in the end of Acts chapter 7, they stoned Stephen. Paul, they tried to stone. They actually stoned, but he managed to survive. The only people who could crucify anyone were the Romans, because they were in charge.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I just wonder what your opinion was of the Mara Bar Serapion matter.
I think that's a good example of a document that tells you about early Christianity. It's not one of the very earliest, which is why I didn't use it. But it's written about in some of the books, like F.F. Bruce's. The New Testament documents, are they reliable? And, you know, I think it's a 2nd century document. Sir?
Do you think that there was a Q document or some sources, written sources, that were used by the New Testament writers? And if so, I know, like some people say, because of the way they're similar, that there was that. And so, do you think the resurrection account and other things that all those things were in Q documents?
Thank you. This takes a bit of explaining. There are some scholars who think that Matthew and Luke use some document which no longer survives, and the scholarly code for this is Q, for whatever reason. We can go into it. Do I believe in that? No. Do I strongly disbelieve in it? No, not really. Do I think the New Testament writers had written sources beforehand? Of course. Luke's Gospel begins and says, many people have tried to, or not tried to write, have written, undertaken to write accounts of everything that's happened amongst us. So I think there were lots of records of Jesus. Some people say it was an oral culture back then, and in many ways it was. But we also know that one of the things that people would do is carry around wax tablets. They'd erase the wax writing and they'd just write on again. That means people could have taken notes on things Jesus said, even as he taught. In fact, when Jesus had disciples, we could rename those disciples as students. That's what they are. Their job for those 3 years is to learn everything the teacher, the rabbi, says. So whether they try to pack it into their brains or whether they write it down, I think it can be done quite reliably. There are